The office felt colder that morning, though the sunlight still spilled softly through the glass windows. Sam sat quietly by the conference table, waiting for Ly to arrive. She glanced at the clock. He was 15 minutes late. Normally, Ly would have texted her, teasing that he was on his way. But today, there was only silence. Then the sound of laughter drifted through the hallway. Ly walked in, his face lit with a smile, the kind of smile that used to be only hers. Beside him was a young woman, new to the company, with bright eyes and a confident stride. As they talked, Ly's eyes lingered on her face just a little too long. It wasn't anything obvious, not enough for anyone else to notice, but for Sam, it was everything. Her heart tightened in her chest, a quiet ache she couldn't explain. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, that Ly was simply being kind, polite, professional. Yet deep down, a small, sharp voice whispered that something was different. When the meeting began, Ly barely looked her way. His voice, once warm and full of affection even in public, was now distant, cool, and measured. Sam stared at him across the table, searching for the man who used to reach for her hand under the desk, who once promised to never let her feel alone again. And in that moment, when Ly's eyes stayed on someone else's face instead of hers, Sam knew something between them had begun to change. The following days passed like slow-moving clouds, calm on the surface, heavy underneath. Sam tried to stay composed, forcing herself to smile each time Ly entered the room. But his gaze no longer lingered on her the way it once did. His questions were shorter, his tone cooler, his laughter now shared with someone else. At lunch, Ly often sat with the new assistant, discussing projects over steaming bowls of noodles. From afar, Sam watched them, her heart twisting a little more each time that girl made him laugh. It wasn't jealousy that consumed her. It was fear. Fear that the bond they built through storms, sacrifices, and sleepless nights was slowly fading, replaced by something simpler, newer, fresher. When Ly finally came home late one evening, the scent of rain clinging to his coat, Sam tried to start a conversation. "Did you eat dinner?" she asked softly. He nodded, barely glancing her way. "Yes, I grabbed something with the team. It's been a long day." The room fell silent. The sound of the clock ticking filled the space between them, louder than words. Sam stood there, clutching the corner of the table, her heart breaking quietly. She wanted to ask if the team meant her, that new girl who now seemed to occupy the place Sam once held. But she didn't ask. She simply smiled, a fragile, trembling smile, and whispered, "You should rest then." When Ly disappeared into his office, closing the door behind him, Sam sat down by the window, staring out into the drizzle. Her reflection in the glass looked tired, faded. She ran her fingers over her coffee cup and thought, when did we stop talking like before? Outside, the rain kept falling quiet, endless, and cold, just like the silence that had begun to grow between their hearts. It happened on a Friday afternoon, the kind of day when the sun should have brought warmth, but instead, everything felt strangely hollow. Sam had forgotten her phone in Ly's office earlier that morning. She waited until most people had gone home before walking down the hallway to retrieve it. As she reached the slightly open door, laughter floated out light, carefree and achingly familiar. It was his laugh, the one that used to echo through their kitchen when she burned breakfast or when he teased her for being stubborn. But now, it was directed at someone else. Sam froze. Through the narrow gap in the door, she saw Ly standing beside the new assistant, showing her something on his phone. Their faces were close, too close. The girl leaned in, smiling up at him, her voice soft and playful. Ly didn't move away. Instead, his eyes lingered, that same lingering look that had haunted Sam for days. For a brief second, The world tilted. The warmth in her chest turned to ice. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob but then stopped. What would she even say? That she was jealous? That she was hurt because the man she loved now looked at someone else the way he once looked at her? She quietly stepped back, heart pounding. The laughter continued behind the door, muffled but sharp as broken glass. Outside, the evening wind was cold against her cheeks, but she barely felt it. She wandered aimlessly down the street, her heels clicking on the pavement like echoes of a fading love. By the time she reached home, her eyes were dry, but her heart was in ruins. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space beside her, the space where Ly used to sit, used to whisper that she was the only one he'd ever love. And in that heavy, suffocating silence, Sam realized that maybe love doesn't die in one loud moment of betrayal sometimes. It fades quietly, like light slipping away at sunset. For the first time in months, Ly noticed that the house felt empty, too quiet, too still. The warmth that once filled every corner had vanished, replaced by a chill he couldn't quite name. Sam no longer waited for him by the door. She no longer brewed his favorite tea or asked about his day. Instead, she moved around him like a ghost, polite, distant, almost invisible. When he spoke, she only nodded. When he smiled, she turned away. At first, Ly thought it was stress, the usual tension of work, but as the days stretched on, he began to sense something deeper, something he had ignored for too long. One night, as he returned home late, he found her sitting alone on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the city lights. Her eyes were distant, the same eyes that once glowed whenever she saw him. "Sam," he said softly, walking closer. "Why are you sitting out here in the cold?" She didn't look at him. "It's quieter out here," she replied, her voice calm but heavy. "Inside, everything reminds me of someone I used to know." Ly's heart sank. He knelt beside her. "What do you mean?" Sam finally turned to him, her gaze piercing. "You're here, Ly," she said. "But you're not really here. Your eyes, your laughter, your thoughts, they're somewhere else. I see it every day." Ly swallowed hard. "That's not true." She gave a small, sad smile. "Then why do I feel like I've already lost you?" For a long moment, neither spoke. The night breeze brushed past them, carrying the faint scent of rain. Ly reached for her hand, but she gently pulled away. It was then in the ache of that simple rejection that Ly finally understood. Love wasn't something that disappeared all at once. It was something you could lose slowly, carelessly, one distracted glance at a time. He wanted to speak, to explain, to tell her that the girl in the office meant nothing. But words suddenly felt too small, too late. The only thing that filled the silence between them was regret, raw and irreversible. And for the first time, Ly felt what Sam had felt for weeks. The quiet heartbreak of watching love slip through your fingers while the person you love still stands right in front of you. The following morning, the sky was heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the distance that had grown between them. Ly woke up early, his heart restless. He could no longer ignore what had been broken, or the quiet ache in Sam's eyes that haunted him through every breath. He walked into the kitchen where she stood, preparing breakfast in silence. The faint sound of chopping vegetables filled the air, but there were no words between them. Ly took a deep breath and spoke softly. "Sam, let's talk." She froze for a moment, then continued cutting without looking up. "There's nothing to talk about, Ly. You've already made your choice." He stepped closer, his voice trembling. "No, I was foolish. I was distracted, but I never chose anyone else. I just forgot to show you that you were always the one." Sam sighed, setting down the knife. Her eyes glistened under the pale morning light. "Do you know what hurts most, Lee?" she whispered. "It's not that you looked at someone else. It's that you stopped looking at me." Her words pierced through him like cold rain. Lee felt a lump form in his throat. "You're right," he admitted. "I took your love for granted. I thought it would always be there waiting, forgiving, patient. But I was wrong." Sam turned away, hiding her tears. "It's too late, Lee. You can't rebuild what's already fallen apart." But then, Lee gently reached for her hands, his voice firm but tender. "If the walls are broken, I'll rebuild them. If the light has faded, I'll bring it back. I don't care how long it takes, I just want to earn your smile again." Rain began to fall outside, tapping against the window like soft applause from the sky. For a long time, neither of them spoke, only the rhythm of the rain filled the silence between their hearts. Finally, Sam lifted her gaze. "Words are easy, Lee," she murmured. "But love needs proof." He nodded slowly, his eyes full of quiet determination. "Then let me prove it. Every day. In every way I can." And in that fragile moment, though nothing was yet forgiven, something in her heart began to thaw, a faint warmth flickering amid the storm. Outside, the rain poured harder, washing away the traces of yesterday's pain. And perhaps, beneath that storm, a new beginning was quietly waiting, fragile, uncertain, but real. Because sometimes, love doesn't end in silence. It begins again in the sound of a single promise whispered beneath the rain. Love, like a fragile flower, doesn't die overnight. It withers slowly when neglected, when glances wander, when words of care are left unspoken. The story of Lee and Sam reminds us that affection isn't something we own, but something we must nurture every single day. Sam's silent tears and Lee's late realization reveal one timeless truth. Love is not lost in betrayal, but in indifference. When one heart stops being seen, when one soul stops feeling valued, distance grows quietly, invisibly, until it feels like two strangers living under the same roof. Yet, this story is not just about loss. It's also about awakening. Lee's regret and his promise to rebuild are symbols of redemption, that even after mistakes, love can bloom again if there is honesty, humility, and consistent effort. Forgiveness, as Sam learned, is not weakness. It's strength, the strength to face the pain, acknowledge it, and choose whether to let love live again or finally set it free. And Lee's journey shows that realizing one's fault is not enough. One must act, prove, and show love through the smallest gestures, not just words. In every relationship, there will come a moment when the eyes are tempted to wander, but the heart, if it still remembers, can always guide us back. Because true love isn't about perfection or possession. It's about attention, care, and the courage to look at the same person every day and still choose them even when it's hard. So, if ever you find your partner's eyes dim with sadness, don't wait for silence to become goodbye. Hold their hand, listen to their heart, and remind them why you fell in love in the first place. For when the eyes forget, it is the heart that remembers, and it is in remembering that love finds its way home.